Brian, Eagle Scout Vigil Honor from Vermont. It's been my collecting focus really for quite some time now. So through this presentation, just want to kind of share history of the camps from Vermont. Obviously, it's the Honor Camper Society for Order of the Arrow. I think the camp history there is important as it's really kind of bound with some of the pre-OA societies in Vermont, as well as the lodges where, it really did exist as almost a summer camp program for quite some time. And then we'll kind of discuss some of the more rare issues in Vermont, but we'll just give everybody a brief overview of history and then some of the tougher Vermont issues. And so in this photo I took, this is for a presentation, Centennial History, that we put together, and you can see the bottom right there, kind of an homage to the original Wabanengo Lodge Emblem Handbook. That's where I kind of got the idea originally for the AGIPO, kind of the lodge catalogs. So the camps and pre-OA societies. So Vermont had several camps. I think it's unique as it still just has one council and one lodge that's somehow resisted merger, even though it's kind of moved around sections in New England and then between New York, currently in 3B there in New York. But there's several camps. The ones really to focus on are Sunrise, Plymouth, Zach Woods, and then eventually Mount Norris. But these are really where the Order of the Arrow kind of stood up from the lodges, as well as where some of the pre-OA societies are. So we don't have a lot of information on, at least in depth, on the pre-OA societies, but there were several. So the first interesting of note comes from the Bristol Herald. Bristol there is right near Camp Sunrise in southern Vermont, and it talks about a Camp Honor Society that's secretive, known only as OS. I've speculated potentially means Order of Sunrise, but as you can see in the end, this is an oppressive Indian ceremony. That's from 40, and so it's 6 years before any lodge was founded in Vermont. And then the same below, coming from Edward Morse's The History of Camp Plymouth that he put together in 77. And this talks about the Honor Camper Society. And that ribbon to the right is the original ribbon from 46, lucky enough to find by chance to put in my collection. But that is probably the most well-known pre-OA society in Vermont. That started at Camp Plymouth. That really started about 6 years before Nicowegie, which was founded in Plymouth. But the same summer at Camp Zach Woods in 1946 is when Vermont's first lodge was founded, which is Wheezy-Ellicon 351. So that was chartered August 21st, 1946, with the first induction occurring that year. Their totem is Mount Mansfield. There in the center patch is the R1, and so Mount Mansfield kind of graces that, tallest peak in Vermont, so it's fitting. And then the profile of the mountain is supposedly looks like a man's face lying down, and that kind of comes from some of the Native American lore in the area. But it's translated to living solid face. We still don't know what language it is. It's not Abenaki. Some of the other options out there we've explored and really haven't come to what the translation is. But it's interesting. We do, from notes, know that's what it means. So they held their first induction ceremony in Zach Woods there. The patch on the bottom was the 46 summer camp season patch. And some of the lore that's been passed over from the lodges, they said prominent members of the Philadelphia Lodge came up. And I'll talk at the end about the founders' kind of connection with Vermont, but a lot of people speculated that potentially either Goodman or Edson were present for this original induction. The same with actually Nicowegie Lodge in 1953. And so Wheezy was the longest running lodge in Vermont in total until AGIPO, and so they lasted from 46 until their final merger was solidified there in 73 with Neon Lodge coming out of southern Vermont. And then this photo in the upper right is a photo of original ceremonies in the 50s. And then the bottom right is the Wheezy Neckerchief slide. It's probably the toughest, right up there with the R1, just a wob issue there in the middle. Those are probably the two toughest issues from Wheezy to find. I actually know more of the R1 than I do of the Neckerchief slide. Just some interesting issues. That is a Neil slide. It's got the sticker on the back, painted by Neil and all that. Going to Memphremagog 398. This is the next lodge in Vermont. So that was chartered in fall of 1948. And again, I think this probably grew from what we saw there in the newspaper article 1940s OS. However, this didn't come around until 48. Their totem is the osprey there. The F1 flap on the bottom. It's one of my favorite Vermont flaps. Beautiful osprey there with the lake behind being Memphremagog Lake in Vermont, which means beautiful waters in Abenaki. And they held their first induction ceremony at Camp Sunrise. We think in the 48 season, although camp brochure does mention Order of the Arrow being an available option based on your performance at camp on the 49 season. So that's the first time we see a reference in a camp pamphlet. And they merged with Nicowegie Lodge in 1965 for Neon 398. And then in the upper right there is actually one of the original fire rings. So the CS Camp Sunrise Sunburst there, that's one that I actually found a uniform pocket that I bought that had a khaki and red strip. So I think we can date it probably right around late 40s, early 50s. But I did my Ordeal Brotherhood and Vigil at Sunrise. So Sunrise has always been near and dear to me. Bottom right is the R1 Memphremagog Neckerchief. Memphremagog in its existence only had 2 flaps and 2 issues of a neckerchief on much different neckerchief material, and the patch was a little bit clearer in the second iteration. But those are some of the rare issues for Memphremagog. Wheezy has a big following, but Memphremagog items by far, I think, are probably the rarest to come across, even if they don't demand the same price. Nikkowechi Lodge, chartered in May of '53, originally as Kola Lodge, and that's what it came out in the National Records as, but was changed shortly thereafter. No mention of Kola Lodge beyond that, and in the documentation we found no patch for Kola Lodge. They did change to Nikkowechi. Obviously, Kola already existed, so maybe there's an issue there with that. But I know for New England guys, Nikkowechi also, I think, existed as a pre-OA society there in the New England area. As you see there, I don't know what the translation is. Totem obviously is the black bear. They held their first induction ceremony at Camp Plymouth, and this is directly connected to the Camp Plymouth Honor Society that I mentioned earlier. So we know this kind of grew from that in that program at Plymouth. In the upper right, it's interesting. Ed Morse's book talks about pre-OA society being in '46, but that from a 1938 camp pamphlet of scout dressed as a Native American there overlooking Camp Plymouth. And it doesn't mention anything about pre-OA, but that's kind of an interesting thing to me, just to see and be a prominent feature in that pamphlet. On the far left there is a Camp Plymouth patch from the early mid-50s. And then the bottom here, I think the 2 rarest Nikkowechi items for this lodge is the Neil neckerchief slide there on the bottom left, and then the N1 Nikkowechi neckerchief. We actually found a reference in one of the old Nikkowechi newsletters of a pre-order for these, and I estimate, based on the newsletter, that there was either an order of 25 or 50 of these produced. But for the neckerchief, I think 5 or 6 are maybe known, maybe less, and for the neckerchief slide, maybe the same. And the bottom right is the only event that Nikkowechi Lodge hosted. It was the Area 1B conference at Camp Plymouth in 1963, and that was attended by both Goodman and Edson. So the mergers in Vermont kind of began, 3 lodges all existing at the same time with 3 councils, and in 1965, Nikkowechi and Memphremagog merged, formed Neonk 398 and Ethan Allen Council. Their totem there is a catamount. It's a panther originating from Vermont. It actually was declared distinct in 2018. Last one was shot in 1881, and there's actually still a stuffed one that exists in the Vermont Historical Society, which is actually pretty cool. I've seen it. This lodge actually met at both Camp Sunrise and Plymouth, where the former councils and lodges had existed, continued events there, and then they merged with Wheezy in 1972 and becoming really official in '73. And the last lodge chief of Neonk became the first lodge chief of Adjecpo. His son's a friend of mine, so that's kind of a cool connection there. And then these are 2 of their items. They produced 3 flaps and 2 different versions of a neckerchief, really the same, just 2 different runs. The bottom is a P1B, which is commonly found off of the neckerchief, and then the top is the F1, which is another one of my favorites. It's a very simple flap, but I really like the design of the cat. And when I've asked older Neonk members if they remember this flap the first time I got one, they said they'd never seen it before. So I estimate this was probably around '65. It maybe disappeared until they brought the S1 out, probably in the late '60s. But this is, I think, another underrated flap. Not that common, not that pricey compared to other stuff out there. So the current lodge, I say a long history. I think in today's day and age, it's unique that lodge and council can exist so long without absorbing anything. So Adjecpo is about to hit that 50-year mark, actually, and has existed pure since really October 1972, full merger beginning, or starting in 1973. Same with Green Mountain Council. So Adjecpo Lodge is the current lodge for Vermont, and on the right there's more recent ceremony being conducted. The S1, just barely pre-fleur-de-lis there in the middle of the slide, that existed from '73 until '78, and this was one per event. Not heavily restricted, but talked to several current members who were in at the time. Remember, you could buy one at your review. You could buy one if you attended another lodge function in that. So not overly common, but not super rare either way. It's a nice flap, and it's actually a little bit narrower. It doesn't fit on the pocket very well. And then on the bottom is our current flap. I think it's an S41 maybe. The lodge is done well, I think, and not overproducing. Nonetheless, their totem is buck. Comes from the Delaware language. They currently meet at Camp Sunrise. MNSR is Mount Norris Scout Reservation. That's in the northern part of Vermont. So when Zach Woods really moved to Zach Woods 2 and eventually assumed the property there at Mount Norris, that's where Wheezy Ellicott met until their merger. And as I said, Adjecpo currently serves Green Mountain Council 592. And I put the plug there on the bottom right, which I think is the rarest Adjecpo patch, the only OA issue from Vermont missing, or official issue. Photos courtesy of Roy Weatherby. I mentioned this before, but the event was canceled due to a flu outbreak at Norwich University, and so they mailed these out. And I've only seen 2 in person, and I know of 3, maybe 4. So I don't know if they got mailed out and got thrown away, or somebody's sitting on them somewhere. And so kind of the final piece here is the founders' connection to Vermont. So I think a lot of people don't realize how deep-rooted both the founders are to Vermont. So Dr. Goodman resided in Bonneville, Vermont for many, many years, as well as Colonel Edson's family has a long history in Brookfield. Before him, he attended Dartmouth College, which is nearby in New Hampshire, and Hanover, right across the river from Vermont, and had a residence in Brookfield as well. In fact, he's buried in the East Brookfield Cemetery in Vermont with other family members of his. Dr. Goodman was a member of the Memphremagog Lodge, as well as the executive board of Green Mountain Council for many years, almost the entirety of the time that they existed. And a unique article there on the right is actually from the Rutland Daily Herald in Vermont in 1965. The patch at the bottom was the area conference hosted by Memphremagog Lodge at Camp Sunrise. And so in 65, even though it was the 50th anniversary of the Order of the Arrow, Dr. Goodman chose to attend the Vermont hosted conference there with Memphremagog Lodge, being at least his current lodging council. And he actually mentioned in the article that it would be the only conference he attended that year beyond the National Order of the Arrow conference. So I thought that choice was significant based on all of the other conferences across the country that, even given his age, he could have traveled to. And then probably one of the more final events that was attended, Colonel Edson attended the Camp Plymouth, Vermont conclave there hosted by Badgepo in 1980. And then in 2000, I think this is actually one of the first events my dad attended after kind of coming back active with Order of the Arrow. The Adjupo Fall Fellowship was held at Stratton, Vermont, and they did a trip to the Brotherhood Barn. So the Brotherhood Barn was created, I believe, in 1950, and it's at the Goodman residence in Vermont. And all the lodges at the time donated stones and I think $3 to build this fireplace within Goodman's residence as a gift, and that still exists actually as a LLC as of 2018. Brotherhood Barn is still there, and it's still something that can go be seen. I don't know about toured, but I think you can coordinate and still actually see it. So there's a pretty strong connection to Vermont with the founders, and I think the final story I go with is from a friend of mine who attended the 73 Jamboree, and so there was I think it was good, it might have been Goodman and Edson, at least as the story goes. We're discussing with some of the, earlier number lodges, 1, 2, 3, as it may go, and Adjupo's 351 walks in, and all the other lodges kind of, give him the eye of, well, you're not one of the original, lodges that was stood up, and one of the founders said, sure, they're invited, that's where we live right now, so kind of an interesting anecdote. And then finally, some references for the presentation, and then the History of Camp Plymouth, great book by Edward Morse, really awesome detailed history of Camp Plymouth. Originally, he's from Massachusetts. If you ever find a copy of that, it's worth picking up. And then a couple of the Facebook pages, and then finally the history of the Brotherhood fireplace there in Vermont. So that concludes the presentation. If anybody has any questions.
I have a question regarding the WISI R1 felt. There's a color variety between the R1 and the R2. Can you talk about how distinctive that is and the difference of the rarity of those two?
Yeah, absolutely. So the R2 came out in the late 50s, and it's a very, very dark blue, like a midnight blue almost. The R1 I showed is a light purple. And if you see them in relatively good condition, it's a stark difference in person. The R1 actually was featured in the 1948 Order of the Arrow Handbook as one of the 10 emblems there, and kind of an example. So I thought that was interesting. But beyond that, Dwight Mitchell's book is the next time that actually shows up. But based on its presentation there in the 48 Handbook, it probably came out sometime in 47, early 48 to make it in there. And the R2 was mid to late 50s because we have some research and some documentation about when the Wheezy neckerchief came out. But the difference in rarity is pretty stark. The R2, not uncommon, not common. I think they average out currently maybe $300 to $400, and the R1 exceedingly more rare. I think the last one sold for somewhere around $2,300 or $2,400.
I'll share one more thing for y'all. So there was an earlier council in Vermont called Owl Council. OWL was 3 different counties in Vermont. Brian can help me out, I'm sure, with what they were. Are y'all seeing that?
Yeah.
So I do not own these. I wish I did. You want to talk about holy grails?
Oh, man.
So here's an Owl Council Camp 1927 and 1928 felts. Very, very cool stuff. I do not own these. I wish I did. This is a Camp Maine need for me.
Yes, I think it was Orange, Windsor, Lamoille was the 3.
Lamoille, right? Yeah, there you go. I can remember Lamoille, but I can remember Owen
the only one's known.
Yeah.
Yeah, those are awesome. I'd like them. So
Yeah, this is great. All right, it's just fantastic stuff y'all are showing.